In 1911, a man by the name of Aurelio Fenn completed the most dangerous book ever rendered by hand. It was neither a book on warfare nor a political manifesto. It was an atlas. Before starting, let me know where you are watching this video from, and I would request you to subscribe to my channel for more videos. 47 plates of meticulously hand-engraved cartography. Each plate revealed the world not as governments wished it to be seen, but as it had truly functioned before the redrawing commenced. Trade corridors, resource zones, indigenous economic networks stretching across 3 continents. The borders were not the ones taught in schools. They were older, and they were real. By 1912, the atlas had vanished. Fenn himself perished in a London boarding house on a Thursday morning in October of that same year, at age 61, leaving behind no surviving family and no forwarding address for his estate. The atlas was never catalogued, never reviewed. It appeared in exactly one letter written by a junior archivist at the Royal Geographical Society, who described it as a work of extraordinary provocation, only to add in the same breath that it had been removed from consideration, removed, not rejected, not returned, but removed. That single word marks where this story begins. Aurelio Fenn was born in 1851 in Trieste, then a port city under Habsburg rule, a place that existed precisely because borders were negotiated and renegotiated by men in rooms who had never once stood at the edge of the territory they were dividing. His father worked as a customs clerk. His mother kept accounts for 3 different merchant families, each trading in goods that the official ledgers quietly left unnamed. Fenn grew up understanding something most educated Europeans of the 19th century preferred not to examine too closely, that the world's economy and the world's map were 2 entirely different things. He studied cartography in Vienna, then surveying in Edinburgh, then spent 11 years in the field working for a private geographical society funded by a consortium of commodity traders who needed accurate information about where things actually were, other than where governments claimed they were. He mapped river routes through the interior of West Africa. He charted mountain passes used by wool merchants in Central Asia, whose trade lines predated the Silk Road by centuries. He documented overland caravan routes across the Sahara that had operated continuously for 400 years, entirely invisible to European colonial administrators who believed they had discovered a continent of unorganized wilderness. What Fenn observed, again and again, was the same pattern. The economic life of the world possessed its own geography, and that geography was being systematically destroyed, border by border, treaty by treaty, concession by concession. This was no accident. In the 1880s and 1890s, the carving of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific into colonial territories followed a logic that most history books describe as political, competing European empires drawing lines to avoid conflict with one another. That is true as far as it goes, but what it omits is the economic engineering beneath. When the Berlin Conference of 1884 divided the African continent among European powers, the borders that emerged were not random. They cut through the Saharan salt trade routes, separating producers from buyers who had traded continuously for centuries. They bisected the palm oil networks of the Niger Delta, leaving collection points on one side of a colonial boundary and processing centers on the other, creating an artificial dependency on European middlemen that had not previously existed. They divided the cattle routes of the Maasai, the Zulu, and the Fulani in ways that destroyed mobile pastoral economies and forced settlement into areas where settled farming was barely viable. The borders were not merely political, they were economic weapons, and they worked. Fenn devoted the last 15 years of his life to documenting what had existed before. He interviewed elderly traders in Kano and Zanzibar who remembered the old routes. He cross-referenced Ottoman tax records with Portuguese shipping ledgers and Arab geographical manuscripts from the 12th century. With extraordinary precision, he drew the economic territories that had flourished before the colonial remapping, showing the resource corridors, the trade networks, the zones of production, and exchange that had sustained hundreds of millions of people for generations before European administrators arrived with straight lines and ink pens. His central argument was this: the poverty of the colonized world was not a starting condition, it was a manufactured outcome. The borders had been drawn specifically to sever economic relationships, to destroy existing market structures, and to forge new dependencies that benefited the colonizers. The map of the world as it existed in 1900 was neither natural nor inevitable. It was a financial instrument, and he could prove it. Plate by plate, route by route, the atlas showed exactly what had been destroyed and who had profited from its destruction. He completed the work in the summer of 1911 and submitted it, through a personal contact, to the Royal Geographical Society in London, along with a covering letter requesting publication under the Society's imprint. That covering letter survives in the Society's archive, the atlas does not. The junior archivists note the one mentioning the atlas being removed from consideration was written in November of 1911. A second note, written by a senior fellow of the Society, whose name has been redacted in the archival copy, describes the work as geographically sound but politically unsuitable. A third document, a brief internal memorandum dated January 1912, notes only that the Fenn submission had been returned to the author. But Fenn, who by that point was living in a single rented room in Paddington, left no record of ever receiving it back. His landlady, interviewed years later by a researcher working on an entirely unrelated project about Victorian boarding houses, remembered him as a quiet foreign gentleman with many papers who had died unexpectedly, and whose room had been cleared out by two men she did not recognize, men who arrived the morning after his death and spent several hours removing his belongings before she could think to object. Those men were never identified. What is known is that in the months before his death, Fenn had written at least 6 letters to European academics and geographers describing the atlas and its contents. None of those recipients ever publicly acknowledged receiving the letters. One of them, a professor of economic geography at the University of Berlin, did make a curious note in his personal diary in early 1912, describing a visit from 2 English gentlemen who asked him questions about a colleague's cartographic work and suggested, in terms he found difficult to characterize, that academic discretion would be appreciated. He did not name the colleague. He did not pursue the matter. The diary entry was discovered by his granddaughter in 1987, who donated his papers to a university archive, where they sat unexamined for another 30 years. The atlas has never resurfaced. No copy is known to exist. 3 of the preparatory drawings, loose sheets that Fenn had apparently given to a friend in Edinburgh years earlier, are held in a private collection and have never been published. A researcher who examined them in 2003 described them as showing trade networks in the Lake Chad Basin that, if accurate, would substantially revise the standard economic history of West Africa. That researcher's paper was declined by 4 academic journals before being published in a small interdisciplinary review, with a circulation of approximately 200 copies. Here is what makes this more than a story about one man and one book. The economic borders that Fenn was trying to document, the ones deliberately severed in the late 19th century, did not simply disappear when colonial rule ended. They were written into the independence agreements. The new nations of Africa and Asia inherited not just the political borders of colonialism, but its economic architecture. The trade routes that had been broken were not restored. The dependencies that had been manufactured were not dismantled. The new governments were given the maps that the colonizers had drawn, not the older ones showing what had existed before. In 1960, when a wave of African countries gained formal independence, economists and development specialists arrived to assess their situations and found, almost universally, poor countries dependent on single commodity exports, with weak internal markets and limited cross-border trade with their neighbors. This was diagnosed as a developmental problem, a question of institutions, governance, and human capital. The structural adjustment programs of the 1980s, the conditionality frameworks of the International Monetary Fund, the foreign aid architectures of the following decades, all were built on assumption that poverty in the formerly colonized world was a starting condition, a natural state from which these countries needed to be developed. What Fenn's atlas would have shown, if anyone had been allowed to see it, was that this assumption was false. The poverty was not a starting condition, it was a result. The economic geography that had sustained these regions had been methodically destroyed, and the destruction had been mapped, documented, and then erased from the historical record. The erasure itself was the point. There is a field of economic history that emerged in the late 20th century, sometimes called cliometrics, sometimes the new economic history, that has spent decades trying to reconstruct what Fenn was attempting to document by hand in the 1900s. Researchers like Nathan Nunn at Harvard have shown, through quantitative analysis, that the areas of Africa most heavily affected by the slave trade exhibit persistent economic disadvantage that cannot be explained by geography, climate, or any factor other than the disruption itself. Melissa Dell at MIT demonstrated that regions of Peru subjected to the Spanish colonial labor system, called the meta show measurable differences in economic outcomes compared to adjacent regions. Outside the boundaries differences that persist to the present day. Asemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, in work that eventually contributed to a Nobel Prize in economics, argued that the fundamental driver of long-run development differences across countries was the nature of institutions established during the colonial period, institutions themselves shaped by the economic interests of the colonizing powers. All of this work, done with econometrics, satellite data, and digitized historical records, is attempting to prove something that Aurelio Fenn tried to prove with ink and copper plates in a rented room in Paddington in 1911. The borders were not neutral, they were not inevitable. They were financial instruments drawn to create specific winners and specific losers. And the effects are still visible today in every development statistic, every debt restructuring agreement, every conversation about why some parts of the world are rich and others are poor. Fenn knew this, he drew it, and the drawing was taken from him. There is one more piece to this story, and it is the strangest part. In 2019, a researcher working in the private papers of a British commodity trading firm that had been active in West Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries found a single reference to a payment made in November of 1911, described in the ledger only as geographical consultation, resolution of Fenn matter. The firm had extensive connections to the men who ran the Royal Geographical Society at the time. The payment was substantial. The recipient was listed only by initials. The Fenn matter, as though it were a transaction, as though an atlas full of evidence was simply a complication to be resolved, an outstanding account to be settled. We do not know where the atlas went. We do not know who the two men were who cleared out Fenn's room the morning after he died. We do not know what became of 47 plates of hand-engraved copper showing the economic world that colonialism buried. What we know is this: someone paid to make it disappear, and for over a century it worked. The map of the world you learned in school was a choice. It was drawn by people with specific interests to produce specific outcomes, and then taught to generations of children as though it were simply the truth. Aurelio Fenn spent his life trying to show you the map underneath that map, the one that showed what existed before the redrawing. The one that made clear that the poverty, the wealth, and the development gaps we spend so much energy trying to explain were not accidents of history. They were the plan. His atlas vanished in 1912, but the question it was asking has never gone away. The borders are still there. The trade routes are still severed. The dependencies are still producing the same outcomes they were designed to produce. And every year, the world holds another summit about global poverty and publishes another report wondering why the gap refuses to close. The answer was drawn in copper plates by a man in a rented room in Paddington, and then it was taken, and the room was cleared, and the world moved on. But maps have a way of surviving, even the ones someone paid to disappear.